Jake Morrison woke up before the sun, same as always. It was the kind of morning that smelled like wet earth and cedar trees, the kind of smell that told him rain had passed during the night. He stepped out onto the porch of the old farmhouse, coffee mug warming his hands, and breathed in the cool Texas air. From here, you could see most of his family's land, 47 acres of open fields, wild grass, and that one ribbon of water that had been the heart of it all for 3 generations. The creek. Pops used to say, "You take care of the creek, boy, and the creek will take care of you." For 45 years, that creek had fed the earth, dam Pops built with his own hands. It wasn't just a dam, it was a promise. It kept water flowing for the cattle in dry months, kept floods under control during storm season, and gave the downstream farmers what they needed to keep their crops alive. Jake sipped his coffee, expecting to hear that soft, constant whisper of water moving over the rocks. But today, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just silence. He set the mug down, his chest tightening as he walked to the edge of the porch and scanned the land. The morning fog hung low over the grass, but the silver ribbon of water that should have been glistening under it was gone. The creek bed lay dry, cracked like old paint. Fish flopped helplessly in shallow puddles, tails slapping against the mud. Jake's boots were on before the coffee even cooled. The closer he got, the worse it looked. The upstream bend, the one where the kids used to skip rocks and Pops used to cool melons in the summer, was nothing but wet dirt. The dam sat quiet, the spillway useless with no water to guide. Jake crouched down, his hand sinking into the mud. It was still damp, meaning whatever had happened, it was recent. But the depth of the cracks told him the flow had slowed for days, maybe weeks, and that meant someone had known. A flash of memory hit him. Pops, standing tall in the sun, pointing a weathered hand at the dam. "This here is more than a pile of dirt, Jake. This is life. This is legacy. If anything ever happens to that creek, you fight for it like you'd fight for family." Jake stood, scanning upstream. Then he saw it, a scar in the land, cutting across the grass like a wound. Heavy tire tracks, wide as truck beds, ran along the ridge. And further up, beyond the cottonwoods, something glittered in the sunlight. Metal. By the time he reached it, his gut already knew. A wall of fresh concrete stretched across the old creek path, a diversion channel. Water that had run for decades through his family's land had been forced into a wide, man-made trench curving toward a row of newly built houses. Willowbrook Estates. Jake had seen the billboards for it on the highway. Luxury living in the heart of Texas. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Land got developed all the time. But this was theft. He followed the trench, boots grinding against loose gravel, until he reached a locked steel gate. Behind it, an HOA maintenance truck sat parked, logo fresh and shiny on the side. Willowbrook Estates, Homeowners Association. His pulse hammered. He rattled the gate. "Hey, you can't do this." His voice carried across the empty construction site, but no one came. Somewhere inside, a generator hummed, pumping water away from the land his grandfather had built his life on. By noon, Jake had been to the county office. The answer he got chilled him more than the silence of the creek. The land his family had owned for nearly a century wasn't his anymore. Not all of it, just the strip where the creek ran and the dam sat. Somehow, during his deployment in Afghanistan, the HOA had filed papers claiming adverse possession and got the zoning changed. On paper, it was theirs. And with the blessing of the city council, they'd diverted the creek legally, at least by their rules. Jake had seen combat. He'd faced roadside bombs, gunfire, nights where the desert itself felt like an enemy. But this, standing in a quiet office while a clerk shrugged and handed him a stamped document, this cut deeper. This wasn't a battlefield you could clear in a day. This was war in slow motion, and the enemy wore suits. That night, Jake stood by the dam, flashlight beam cutting across the dark, waterless spillway. He thought about Pops. He thought about every farmer downstream who depended on this creek. He thought about the kids who'd never skip rocks here again in the distance. The lights of Willowbrook Estates glowed warm and golden. Inside those houses, people were probably sipping wine, enjoying their new waterfront views, never thinking about the land they'd drained to get them. Jake clenched his fists. They thought he'd roll over. They thought he'd take the loss quietly. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Jake's earliest memory wasn't of toys, or school, or even his own bedroom. It was of the dam. He must have been 5 years old, maybe 6. Pops had taken him down to the creek on a warm spring morning. The air smelled of fresh grass, and the sound of water rushing through the spillway was like music. Pops had a battered old straw hat on, the same one he wore every day in the field, and his hands were calloused from decades of work. See that, Jake? Pops had pointed to the curve of earth and stone holding back the water. That's not just dirt piled up. That's a promise. My daddy and me built it in '78 after the big flood. It's kept the land alive ever since. Little Jake had looked up at him, not really understanding. Why'd you build it, Pops? Pops had smiled, deep wrinkles creasing his weathered face. Because, son, in Texas, water is life. You got water, you got cattle, you got crops. You've got neighbors who'll make it through the dry years. Without water, he'd scooped a handful from the creek, let it spill through his fingers. Without water, the land dies. People die with it. From that day, Jake never saw the dam as just part of the scenery. It was a living thing, and it belonged to his family. Pops was a third-generation Texan, stubborn as a mesquite root. He could fix anything, tractors, fences, even the kitchen sink when Mum said it was hopeless. But his real pride was that dam. He kept it in perfect condition. Every spring, he'd take Jake out to walk the length of it, checking for cracks, clearing branches from the spillway, making sure the water flowed right. This here is more than ours, Pops would say. It belongs to every farmer downstream. We just get the honor of taking care of it. By the time Jake was a teenager, he could operate the sluice gate himself. Pops trusted him with it. Even when neighbors came by asking for a little extra water for their crops. Always be fair, son, Pops said. Water politics can make enemies quick. But if you keep your word, folks will stand by you when you need them. Those words stuck. The farm wasn't rich. Jake's family never drove shiny new trucks or took fancy vacations, but they had enough. And more importantly, they had respect in the community. People knew the Morrisons as fair, hard-working, and loyal. Pops had been the kind of man you could call at 2 a.m. when your well pump broke, and he'd show up with his toolbox before sunrise. Jake wanted to be like that after high school. He went to college for engineering, water systems, dams, and flood control. Pops had been proud, though he never said it much. He just smiled that quiet smile when Jake brought home textbooks full of diagrams and talked about hydraulic pressure, like it was baseball stats. Then came the army. Jake had always felt the pull to serve. Maybe it was the discipline Pops had taught him. Maybe it was wanting to protect more than just his own land. The Army Corps of Engineers was the perfect fit. He'd get to use his skills, travel the world, and make a difference. When he left for Afghanistan, Pops shook his hand like he was sending him off to war in the old days. Firm grip, eyes steady. "You come back, son," Pops said. "And when you do, the creek'll still be here waiting." Jake had believed him, but war changes timelines you can't control. Deployment after deployment, Jake's return kept getting pushed. Pops handled things, even as his health started to fade. Jake called as often as he could, but there were nights when the satellite phone couldn't connect, and mornings when the sound of mortar fire drowned out his thoughts of home. Then, halfway through his last tour, the call came. Mum's voice shaking. Pops had passed in his sleep. Heart failure. Jake wasn't there to say goodbye. The funeral came and went without him. The army sent him a folded flag, and Mum sent a picture of the dam with the sun rising behind it, just like Pops had loved to see. By the time Jake came home for good, the farmhouse felt emptier. Pops's hat still hung on the nail by the door. His boots still by the porch steps. Jake swore to himself he'd take care of the land the way Pops had, even better. Now that he had all the engineering knowledge and discipline from his years of service. But the world had been moving while he was gone. He noticed the Willowbrook Estates coming soon signs on the edge of town. He heard rumors of zoning meetings he'd never been told about. And one morning, standing with a cup of coffee, he realized the creek was gone. That was the day he knew Pops's promise was under attack. Ake had always thought of war as something loud, rifles cracking, engines roaring, boots pounding dirt. But this war was fought on paper, and the paper cut deep. The first time he walked into the county records office, he expected some kind of mistake, a missing signature, a form filed in the wrong drawer, something he could fix in a day instead. The clerk slid a file across the counter without even looking him in the eye. "According to the county," she said flatly, "this section here," she tapped the highlighted portion on the map, "belongs to Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." Jake stared at the map. The section she'd pointed to wasn't just any land. It was the creek, the dam, the spillway. "This is wrong," he said, his voice low but hard. She shrugged. "Adverse possession, rezoning, Ordinance 14-3 to B. It's all in there." Jake flipped through the documents, his hands tight round the edges. The legal terms read like another language, but he understood enough while he'd been overseas. Someone had claimed that section of land, argued it had been abandoned, and pushed a zoning change through the city council to convert it into a water feature easement for the new subdivision. It wasn't just shady, it was surgical. That night, Jake pored over the paperwork at the kitchen table. The name appeared over and over: Margaret Thornwell, HOA President, and next to hers, on some of the rezoning petitions, another name: Councilman Rick Thornwell, husband. And wife, Rick, was the one who chaired the zoning committee meeting where the ordinance had passed. Rick was also an investor in the construction company building Willowbrook Estates, and Maggie. She was the smiling face on the billboards for the development, standing in front of a row of white-pillared houses, promising luxury living in the heart of Texas. Jake leaned back in his chair, anger boiling in his chest. This wasn't some accidental overstep. This was a land grab, dressed up in legal ink and rubber stamps. The next morning, Jake decided to meet them face to face. The HOAS Welcome Center sat just past the gated entrance of Willowbrook Estates. The manicured lawns looked like something out of a brochure, trimmed hedges, fountains spraying in neat arcs, flower beds arranged in perfect symmetry. It was everything Pops's land wasn't natural, wild, alive. Jake walked in the cool blast of air conditioning hitting him like a slap. Behind the desk sat a woman in her early 50s, her hair perfectly styled, a gold HOA badge pinned to her blazer. "Margaret Thornwell?" Jake asked. She looked up from her tablet, smiling with the kind of politeness that wasn't polite at all. "Yes, I'm Jake Morrison," he said. "My family's land borders, Willowbrook. You've diverted the creek." Her smile didn't move, but her eyes sharpened. "Oh, that. Yes, our engineers determined the original creek path was inefficient for our flood mitigation plan. We've improved it for the benefit of our residents." "You mean you stole it?" Jake shot back. Maggie's fingers tapped the desk. "Mr. Morrison, the section of land you're referring to was unmaintained and unused for the statutory period. Under Texas adverse possession laws, it was transferred to the HOA with full city approval." Jake stepped closer. "That creek's been maintained for 45 years. My grandfather built that dam. You don't get to rewrite history because it's convenient." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You served in the military, didn't you? I'd hate for people to start asking questions about your mental stability. We live in sensitive times." Jake froze. He knew a threat when he heard one. Over the next week, the harassment started. First, it was a wellness check from the sheriff's department, an anonymous tip claiming Jake was unstable and possibly a danger to himself. Then came the letters from the HOAS lawyers, accusing him of trespassing every time he set foot near the creek. Online, fake social media accounts popped up, calling him a bitter vet and dangerous recluse. It was coordinated, and it was working. Neighbors started looking at him differently at the feed store. Conversations stopped when he walked in. Jake knew if he tried to fight this alone, they'd bury him. Not under dirt, but under paperwork. Rumors and fear. This wasn't just about his land anymore. This was about a system built to crush anyone who got in the way. Late one night, Jake sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out, Pops's old hat hanging on the wall above him. He whispered to himself, "If this is a war, I need an army." The next few weeks were like living in enemy territory. Jake had thought he'd left war zones behind in Afghanistan, but this was worse in some ways. At least there you knew who the enemy was. Here, the attack came in whispers, in folded letters, in cold stares from people who used to wave when they passed his gate. It started small. One morning, Jake found a bright orange notice nailed to the post at the edge of his property. Unauthorized structure subject to removal. The unauthorized structure was Pops's dam. 2 days later, a drone buzzed over his pasture, low, enough to startle the cattle. When he called the sheriff's office, they said there was no law against aerial photography if the drone wasn't armed. A week after that, a pickup truck idled at the far end of his driveway just after midnight. The headlights stayed on, pointing at the house. When Jake stepped onto the porch with his rifle slung over his shoulder, the truck drove away slow, just slow enough to make sure he saw the HOA logo on the door. Maggie Thornwell knew what she was doing. She didn't just want his land. She wanted to break him, to make him tired, to make him doubt himself, to make him look unstable in front of everyone else. Jake had been through worse. But the thing about war was, in war, you're never really fighting alone here. It felt like the whole county had turned their backs. The real breaking point came on a Sunday morning. Jake drove into town to pick up supplies, some fencing, wire, a bag of cattle feed, and a few bolts for the barn door. As he walked down the aisle of the feed store, two men he'd known since high school turned their backs on him. Another man muttered, just loud enough for Jake to hear, "Crazy war. Heroes losing it." Jake didn't say a word. He just paid for his supplies and left. But when he got back to the farm, the mailbox was open, and inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of an HOA meeting agenda. Item number 4, discussion of potential eminent domain petition for Morrison property due to safety concerns and owner instability. They weren't satisfied with stealing the creek. They wanted everything. That night, Jake sat at the kitchen table with a single light on. The dam was just a shadow in the distance. Pops's hat still hung on the wall like it was watching him, waiting for him to act. He thought about the veterans. He'd served with the ones who'd told him the hardest part of coming home wasn't the memories of combat, but the feeling that no one back home knew what you were worth anymore. Jake wasn't going to let them write him off like that. Not Maggie Thornwell, not her husband, not the HOA. He pulled out a notebook and started making a list. Step 1, find out exactly how they'd done it. Every document, every meeting, every signature. Step 2, learn the laws, water rights, zoning codes, environmental regulations. Use them like weapons. Step 3, find allies. Not just angry neighbors, people who had something to lose and something to fight for. By midnight, the notebook was full of names and phone numbers. A cattle rancher downstream, a lawyer he'd met at a veterans event, an old army buddy now working for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Jake closed the notebook and leaned back. For the first time in weeks, he felt steady. The HOA had their lawyers, their political connections, their money, but Jake had something they didn't. A reason, and a man with a reason is dangerous. The first person Jake called was Earl Banning, a cattle rancher whose land sat downstream from the dam. Earl was old enough to have known Pops, and his family's herd had always relied on the creek's steady flow. When Jake explained the diversion, Earl swore under his breath. They cut that water off, my pastures dry up, and if they flood it wrong, my fences wash out. You gettin' a lawyer? Working on it, Jake said. Count me in, Earl replied. You hit M, I'll hit M too. The second call went to Linda Park, an environmental lawyer Jake had met at a veterans fundraiser 2 years back. She'd once fought a case where a developer illegally filled in wetlands to build a golf course, and won. When Jake told her about the creek diversion, she didn't sound surprised. I've seen this before, she said. They gamble that no one knows enough about water rights to fight them. But if your dam predates their subdivision, that changes everything. It's 45 years old, Jake said. Built by my grandfather. Then you might have seen your water rights. If you do, we've got them by the throat. Jake's third call was to Captain Reggie Owens, an old army buddy now working as a hydrologist for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Reggie listened carefully, then said, if they diverted a natural watercourse without a permit, that's a violation. And if the dam falls under federal jurisdiction, the feds can get involved too. Jake's pen scratched across the notebook. How do we prove that? You let me come out and see it for myself, Reggie said. By the end of the week, Jake had a small but dangerous team. Earl, the rancher who'd lost water, Linda, the lawyer, who knew the environmental battlefield. Reggie, the hydrologist with federal contacts. The first meeting wasn't in a conference room or an office. It was in Jake's barn. A single bulb swung overhead, lighting the table where he'd spread out maps, old deeds, and photographs of the dam. "This," Jake said, pointing to a black and white photo of Pops standing on the spillway, "is where it starts. The dam was built in 1978. We've got permits, construction notes, and a deed that shows water rights from 1923. That's older than half the county." Linda tapped one of the maps. "This diversion they built, it's cutting off the creek just above your intake point. That means they're interfering with senior rights. Under Texas law, that's a big deal." Reggie added, "If we can document that they changed the water course without state approval, the penalties get bigger. And if we involve the Army Corps of Engineers, they'll have to restore the flow." Earl leaned back in his chair. "So we don't just fight him, we hit him from every angle." "Exactly," Jake said. From that night forward, the barn became their war room. Jake started digging through county archives, scanning every zoning change and land transfer the HOA had touched. Linda began drafting legal notices and preparing for injunctions. Reggie took water samples and surveyed the diversion channel, noting how it failed to meet flood mitigation standards. Earl started talking to other farmers, quietly but deliberately, to see who else had been hurt by Willowbrook's improvements. The HOA thought Jake was just a bitter landowner fighting a losing battle. They didn't see the network forming under their noses. Not yet. The plan was simple, but it had to be flawless. They would hit the HOA from 3 sides at once: legal, environmental, and public opinion. On a Monday morning, Linda filed 2 separate injunction requests at the county courthouse. The first demanded an immediate halt to all creek diversion activities until senior water rights could be verified. The second accused the Willowbrook Estates HOA of violating the Texas Water Code by altering a natural watercourse without permits. She timed it so that the injunctions would appear on the county docket just before the HOA's weekly board meeting. That same morning, Reggie sent his preliminary report to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, with a copy to his old contact at the Army Corps of Engineers. It was full of photographs showing the diversion trench cutting through wetland soil, notes on the missing floodgate controls, and a dam maintenance log that stopped the year before Jake left for Afghanistan. The language was careful, but the meaning was clear. This could be a federal matter. Meanwhile, Earl started spreading word at the feed store, the diner, and the cop. He didn't yell, didn't rant. He just told the truth to anyone who'd listen. Willowbrook's cutting off the creek. Dam's gonna dry up, and when it does, so will half the pastures in this valley. It didn't take long before people who'd ignored Jake's warnings were talking about it over coffee and fried eggs. The real blow came on Wednesday night. Jake walked into the Willowbrook HOA meeting wearing clean jeans, a pressed shirt, and Pops's old hat. He wasn't there to shout. He was there to watch. The room was full: residents, board members, a few reporters from the local paper. Maggie Thornwell sat at the center table, smiling like she owned the place. Halfway through the meeting, someone handed her a folded sheet of paper. Her smile faltered for the first time all night. Jake knew exactly what she was reading. A copy of Linda's injunction notice, delivered in person by the sheriff's deputy waiting outside. Maggie tried to keep the meeting going, but then one of the residents stood up. "Is it true," the man asked, "that you rerouted the creek without permits?" "That's a gross exaggeration," Maggie began. Another voice cut in. "Because if the dam goes dry, my cattle are done for." Then another, and my well's already dropping. The room was turning. Jake didn't say a word. He just sat there, letting the questions build, letting Maggie feel the shift in the air. When the meeting ended, Rick Thornwell cornered him near the door. You think this is over, Morrison? You're making a mistake. Jake met his eyes. No, Rick. I think you made yours when you came after my family's land. The next morning, the local paper ran the headline, Veteran claims HOA diverted creek, threatening farms, federal agencies, Ion vs Diage, ATA. The Thornwells weren't smiling anymore. The Thornwells were smart enough to know they couldn't win in the open, not yet. So they did what people like them always do. They went after Jake from the shadows. It started with anonymous complaints. 2 weeks after the injunction notice, a sheriff's deputy showed up at Jake's gate. Mr. Morrison, we've had a call about unsafe structures on your property, the deputy said, looking uncomfortable. Jake walked him out to the barn. You mean this? Been standing 45 years. Passed inspection every time. The deputy nodded, wrote something in his notebook, and left. The next week, it was animal welfare checks. A county officer claimed someone had reported neglected livestock. Jake didn't own any livestock, just 3 barn cats and a stubborn dog named Cooper. The officer left, embarrassed, but the message was clear. They were trying to bury him in nuisance visits. Then came the mental health angle. Jake got a call from the VA clinic. Mr. Morrison, we received a concern from a community member about your well-being. They said you've been behaving erratically and may be a danger to yourself or others. Jake froze, the phone pressed to his ear. Let me guess, he said quietly. They didn't leave their name. No, sir, the voice replied. He knew exactly who it was. Maggie Thornwell was playing the oldest HOA card in the book, weaponizing social stigma, making him look unstable. The smear campaign went public next. An anonymous letter circulated through Willowbrook Estates, claiming Jake was obsessed with the HOA, had violent tendencies from his time overseas, and was mentally unfit to own land in a residential adjacent area. The language was neat, professional, too neat for a random neighbor. Jake kept his cool. He'd been through worse in Afghanistan, but privately, he knew this wasn't just harassment, this was strategy. If they could paint him as unstable, they could undermine his legal case, frighten away his allies, and make federal investigators think twice. When he told Linda, she didn't even blink. This means we're hitting them where it hurts, she said. They wouldn't be coming at you this hard if they weren't scared. Reggie was less diplomatic. Let me guess, he said. Rick's pulling strings at City Hall. Maggie's running the social stuff. Same playbook they've used for years. They just didn't expect someone who knows how to fight back. Earl slammed his coffee mug on the table. Then let's give M something new to be scared of. Jake nodded. We will. But we don't rush. We make our next move unforgettable. The Thornwells thought they could break him. Instead, they were making him sharper. If the Thornwells wanted to play dirty, Jake would dig deeper. Literally, for the next month, Jake split his time between the county records office and old filing cabinets in the barn. At the records office, he pored over zoning maps from the last 40 years. The colors changed like a slow infection. First agricultural green, then pale yellow for mixed use, then deep blue for residential. High value. Every major change lined up perfectly with a Thornwell campaign year. He found a 2008 emergency ordinance that allowed temporary water redirection for flood prevention. signed by Rick Thornwell himself when he was a junior councilman. That same month, the first phase of Willowbrook Estates broke ground. The diversion trench wasn't a recent thing. It was part of a long game. Back at the farm, Pops's filing cabinets coughed up a treasure, a leather-bound ledger with water-level readings from 1978 to 2004. Pops had measured the creek every month for decades, noting rainfall, dam levels, and flow rates. Jake compared the readings to recent ones Reggie had taken. The drop in water flow was more than just seasonal. It was a direct result of the diversion. Linda took one look at the documents and smiled like a cat that had just found the cream. "This," she said, tapping the ledger, "is historical proof, and paired with the zoning records, it shows intent. Not negligence, intent." Reggie added another layer, aerial photos from his environmental work archives. One from 1995 showed the creek in full flow, its channel lush and green. One from last year showed the channel cracked and pale, a thin trickle snaking through weeds. Jake stared at the photos. "We put this in front of the right people. They can't look away." The turning point came when Earl mentioned something, almost in passing. "Do you know, I remember the year they rerouted that creek the first time. Whole load of dirt went missing down to Rick's cousin's ranch. Said it was for landscaping. That led Jake to a chain of land transfers. Parcels sold between family members for $1. Just before zoning changes shot the value through the roof. By the end of the month, Jake had a wall in his living room covered in maps, documents, and photographs. It looked like something out of a detective show, but it was all real. Every line, every note, every signature told the same story. The Thornwells had been bleeding the land for years, and they'd hidden it behind paperwork. Jake stood back, hands on his hips. "We've got enough to bury them in court. Now we just need the right stage to do it on." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Not just court. We need the feds watching when this all comes out." The next phase wasn't about digging anymore. It was about showing. The morning of the inspection dawned crisp and clear. Jake stood at the top of Pops's dam, the spillway gate in front of him, and the creek stretched below like a silver ribbon waiting to run free. Behind him were Linda, Reggie, Earl, and a few federal inspectors from the Army Corps of Engineers. Everything had to go perfectly. "Are you sure about this?" one of the inspectors asked. Jake nodded, his hand on the lever. "It's been 45 years, and Pops built this to last. The water flow has been steady all this time. I calculated the release rate, checked the gates. We'll only open it enough to prove the creek's natural course is blocked. Nothing else." The inspectors exchanged glances. One murmured, "If this works, it'll be textbook evidence." Downstream, Maggie and Rick Thornwell were waiting, smug, confident, unaware. They had their own engineers and lawyers, certain that Jake's claims would collapse under scrutiny. They didn't know he'd anticipated their every move. Jake pulled the lever. A slow hiss began, then a rush as the spillway released the water. The creek came alive. It flowed steadily into its original channel, carving a path through the dry, cracked soil that Reggie measured the flow. "This is exactly as documented. Look at this. The diversion upstream is completely artificial. No permits, no approvals." The federal inspectors started taking notes, cameras rolling. Earl walked downstream with his phone, filming the water rejoining the natural channel. Neighbors peeked over fences, amazed at the sudden surge in flow. Maggie's face turned pale. as she realized the water was moving exactly as Pops had intended. Rick muttered under his breath, his phone buzzing non-stop with emergency calls from their lawyers. Linda handed a folder to one of the inspector's historical photos. Water logs, legal documents. This, she said, voice steady, proves decades of intent to divert water illegally. The HOA's claims of flood mitigation are false. The creek was diverted to increase property value, not to protect residents. The inspector nodded gravely. We'll need full access for investigation. This is federal territory now. As the water flowed freely, the magnitude of their evidence became undeniable. The HOA's entire narrative crumbled in real time. Residents came out of their houses to watch. Farmers cheered. Journalists snapped photos. For the first time in years, Jake saw the community united, not divided by politics, gossip, or fear, but bound by truth and justice. By the afternoon, federal investigators were documenting everything: the dam, the creek, the diverted trench, and the logs dating back to Pops's construction. Maggie and Rick were forced to sit quietly as their fraudulent claims were dismantled in front of multiple witnesses. Jake watched the water, the same creek he had played by as a child, now flowing freely again. He felt Pops's presence beside him. The promise kept. It wasn't just a win on paper. It was restoration. The days after the controlled release were a whirlwind. Federal investigators moved swiftly. Reports were filed, subpoenas issued, and the media descended on Willowbrook Estates. Every move the Thornwells had made over the last 20 years was now under scrutiny. Maggie and Rick tried to spin the story. They hired PR teams, released statements, and called town meetings claiming they were misunderstood, developers trying to protect residents. But no one believed them. The evidence was irrefutable. Decades of diverted water, forged permits, and fraudulent flood mitigation claims. The first real blow came when the federal charges were announced. Maggie faced multiple counts: illegal diversion of a natural watercourse, fraudulent insurance claims, environmental violations. Frack faced charges for conflict of interest in city council, zoning, votes, conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, falsifying documents. Their lawyers scrambled, but the courtroom was a new battlefield, one Jake and his coalition were fully prepared for. Meanwhile, the community rallied. Farmers downstream started documenting water flow improvements. Schools used the story as a case study in civic responsibility, and environmental groups cited Jake's fight in statewide campaigns. Jake's home phone rang constantly. Calls came from agencies, journalists, and even local politicians who had ignored him before. But he kept his focus on one goal: restoring the land and water to its rightful state. Weeks later, the HOA's dissolution was official. Maggie and Rick were removed from their positions, assets frozen, and properties returned to community oversight. A permanent water conservation trust was established, ensuring that no single party could ever divert the creek or mismanage the dam again. The creek flowed freely. Fields that had been parched now shimmered green. Wildlife returned: birds, turtles, and fish reappearing where they had once thrived. The dam, Pops's legacy, stood strong as a symbol of justice and perseverance. Jake walked along the banks, Earl by his side, Reggie checking the measurements, and Linda taking final notes. "You did it, Jake," Earl said. "You really did." "It," Jake smiled, feeling the weight of the months lift. "We did it. Couldn't have done it alone." In the end, Willowbrook Estates became a cautionary tale, a story of corruption exposed, communities united, and environmental justice served. And Jake Morrison, the Army Corps engineer and veteran, had proven that knowledge, courage, and coalition building could challenge even the most entrenched power. With Willowbrook estates dismantled and the creek flowing freely again, many expected Jake to return to a quiet life. But something had changed. Farmers from neighboring counties began calling him. "Can you help us? Our creek's being diverted to, could you advise us before the HOA comes knocking?" Jake realized his fight wasn't just about his family's land anymore. It was about protecting communities, water rights, and environmental justice across Texas. He partnered with Linda and Reggie to form a coalition called the Texas Water Rights Alliance, TWRA. Their mission was clear: monitor water diversion, projects educate property owners about historical and legal water rights, provide legal and technical support to communities facing environmental threats. Word spread quickly. State legislators invited Jake to speak about the dangers of unchecked HOA power and conflicts of interest in local governance. The media followed him to rural towns, documenting successful interventions where Jake and the TWRA helped prevent illegal creek diversions. Meanwhile, the creek on his property became a symbol of resilience and stewardship. Schools brought children to see it, teaching them about conservation, history, and the importance of defending what is right. Even the Army Corps of Engineers took notice, highlighting Jake's controlled release as a model case study in water management and historical preservation. The Thornwell's downfall became a lesson for developers and HOA boards across the state. No longer could they assume that wealth, political connections, or intimidation would guarantee impunity. Jake never sought fame or fortune. For him, the reward was far simpler: the creek flowing naturally, sustaining the land and its people, farmers. Downstream, having reliable water for crops and livestock, a community united, vigilant, and empowered to protect itself. Sitting on the bank of the creek one evening, Jake watched the water sparkle under the setting sun. He thought of Pops, of every challenge, and of the small victories along the way. He realized that this wasn't the end of his fight. It was the beginning of a movement, one that would outlast him and protect generations to come. The story of Jake Morrison, the Army Corps engineer and veteran, became a legend, a testament to perseverance, justice, and the power of one person who refused to let corruption win. The Arc of Stories. If you were inspired by Jake's courage and fight for justice, consider sharing this story, protecting your own community, and subscribing to witness more tales of resilience, truth, and environmental heroism.